My name is Sarah Champion. It's my pleasure to chair the committee and this session. Thank you ever so much for coming. We appreciate that things are quite trying at the moment, so you turning up is really, really appreciated. I wonder if we could start. We're looking for this session to be about 45 minutes long. We'll all be asking you different questions. Again, if there is additional stuff that you want to sort of bring in that you don't feel that our questions have elicited from you, we really want to hear the evidence from you to help us with our decision making. If I could start though by asking each man of the panel just to sort of introduce yourself and a little sort of 1 or 2 line background. Emma, if I could start with you, please.
Yep, I'm a reader in geography at the University of Cambridge, the director of the Margaret Anstey Centre for Global Studies, which is located in Newnham College. And I'm also currently the recipient of some DFID research funding.
Thank you. James.
I'm James Rogers, the director of the Global Britain programme at the Henry Jackson Society. My background is in strategic studies. I taught for many years in Estonia at the Baltic Defence College.
And Ian.
Hi, I'm Ian Mitchell. I'm a senior fellow at the Centre for Global Development, where I look at donor performance, and in particular the UK performance as a development actor.
Thank you very much. I'm asking Ian to
Thanks, sir.
start.
Can I ask you all, the recent launch of the government's integrated review has reaffirmed that we're going to spend 0.7% of our GDP. Should we put in more safeguards to protect that? And you're talking to the Parliament here, so should we start with you, Emma? Should there be more safeguards protecting our 0.7%?
You mean legal safeguards?
Legal and parliamentary.
So in terms of the 0.7 itself, I think there's a question actually over whether that sort of target is useful regardless of if it was 0.2 or 2%. A DFID staff member described it to me as translanding a Boeing 747 on a postage stamp each year. And as a result, I think it's very demotivating, creates extraordinary waste of time, and it's inefficient. So I think in a sense, regardless of if you don't mind that 0.7, any target has accountancy problems that face civil servants. And because 0.7 is so political, they cannot afford to get it wrong. So they are really held to a very tight account. In terms of defending it, I would say that the definition of odour is spectacularly capacious. And what we're seeing at the moment is the hollowing out from the inside. So Australia chose to slash its odour budget, really detrimentally to its own national interests, I think, and soft power. The UK is sticking with it and is held to it. And I think legally it would be very, very difficult to rewrite that legislation, but not impossible. So I think, unfortunately, the process has been to work to hollow it out from within.
James.
I largely agree. For me, the issue is not so much the quantity of money that is spent, i.e. 0.7% of gross national income, but rather what the money is spent on. And more importantly, insofar as this is supposed to be an integrated strategic review, how it is spent in relation to the changing global conditions that we are beginning to move into. And those are conditions that are structured less by the conditions that we've experienced over the last 20 to 30 years, and more by great power competition, which is what our previous reviews in 2018, the National Security Capability Review and the Modernising Defence Programme, both outlined. And I think in those circumstances and in those conditions where the likes of China or Russia are seeking to fundamentally revise the international order or the regional orders surrounding themselves, we need to think more about how we can push back against them and to prevent them from corrupting the very order that we will depend on for our peace and our security and well-being.
Yeah.
So just briefly, I wanted to say it's good the integrated review is broader than just aid spending. I think development is a lot more than just the money we spend overseas. I think in terms of safeguards in the UK, I think the degree of hollowing out, as Emma puts it, is relatively limited. And I think the reason we know that is because it's relatively transparent and we have good oversight from the Development Select Committee, we have ICAI, the UK government is transparent with IATI and in the aid programmes it publishes. And I think we're all clear about the balance that ministers are choosing between poverty reduction, commercial interest or global public good. So I think it's there to see. I mean, the definition is quite forgiving. I think it does allow you to do quite a lot, which is why I'm sometimes surprised that the government thinks it wants to broaden the definition even further. I don't think there's there's much that you'd want to do that couldn't fall under the target. So I think it's reasonably transparent and clear. I think there are the judgments that ministers are making on the balance between national interest and poverty reduction are not necessarily the ones that we would all take, but I don't think that the safeguards are the problem. I think the judgment is being made and we can see it.
Can I come back to James? Because you at the beginning talked about the targeting. Do you think that we have targeted enough through the Act to make sure that the money that we do put aside, we've got to guarantee that, and again you mentioned it as well, goes to the poorest and most vulnerable? Do we need to do more of a guarantee? I mean, you were talking about targeting. Do we need to go further?
I'm not necessarily that we do, because my understanding of international development is perhaps broader than some other people's. I think that the attention that we give to trying to alleviate extreme poverty in a material sense needs to be rethought, because in the changing global conditions that I identified earlier, we will see increasingly countries like Russia and China seeking to completely rewrite and completely transform the rules of the game within their respective regions and therein. And I'm not sure under those circumstances the spread of authoritarian government is actually in anyone's interest, even those that are potentially the poorest and most vulnerable people in the world. And it certainly, I think, isn't in our interest either. So I think we need to focus more on the impact that those countries are going to have and are already having through their own programs, which are very different to ours. And instead, we need to think about how we can push back against them. So I, for example, would like to see much more attention given to the promotion of democracy and good governance, rather than to focus on extreme poverty in a sort of limited material sense. And I would say further that I think we need to do that understanding that this is an increasingly competitive international environment. And unless we understand that, then we're at a structural disadvantage.
Can I just bring Richard?
Yeah.
Dr. Maudsley, I'd just like to go back to something you said at the beginning. The problem of landing your departmental budget, whether or not you have the legal protection or incubus, depending on your point of view, of a statutory percentage of GNI, exists anyway. It was Patricia Hewitt who said that landing a jumbo jet on a postage stamp was like what running the NHS budget was doing. So can I just be clear what it is that you're saying and what you're not saying? Because you mentioned targets having caused problems. There are lots of people who think targets cause problems in lots of different domains. I have a particular concern about the absorption capacity in many countries. If we have a growing economy, which doesn't look like it's going to be a problem in the near future, but if we have a growing economy, you suddenly have a need to spend extra all of a sudden within a specified time. I can see that being a big problem. But what are you saying generally? I noticed that your CV refers to your interest in donor exit and also in the private sector-led growth agenda. Are you saying that, and I don't want to put words into your mouth, are you saying that by definition having this kind of structural target embedded in legislation makes things worse, or are you saying actually it's a good thing but we need special thought and safeguards around it?
Thanks for the correct attribution. So it's a generic accountancy issue within government, full stop. And it'd be interesting, I wonder, a very big government project to try and find a different way of doing that sort of accountancy project and budgeting. But you're quite right, that's across government and not just ODA. Of course, ODA is very political. You have the Daily Mail seriously breathing, and still to this day, breathing down one's neck. And of course, quite properly, ICAI and NAO holding up that, reaching 0.7 on the other hand. So that's one set of issues. And then the other set of issues is what we do within it. And I would say, Ian is right, and I think DFID have done very well, supported by ICAI, this committee, and other institutions around British development, to hold to the principles of poverty reduction. I think that we are seeing all sorts of... I'm less sanguine than Ian about the hollowing out. I do think that is happening, and I'd be very happy to say more about this. I particularly don't think we just need to frame this in terms of, this is bad for poor people in poor countries. I actually think the real danger is that we do neither thing well. That we, for example, if we're doing security strategy, it can work very well. It has worked very well in some places like Sierra Leone, but it's terribly in other places. And for other donors, this is true too, in Afghanistan and elsewhere. Or I work a lot in India, and there's a very strong dimension of economic diplomacy. Basically, we want to look a lot more like Japan. The Indian central government welcomes Japan and Japan's ODA with open arms. Japan is a welcome visitor to the door. The British turn up with this sort of these hodgepodge of trying to make this very fairly how do I put it, not very malleable thing called ODA. And we're neither doing economic diplomacy very well, and nor are we particularly doing the dangerous poverty reduction very well. So I'm interested with, it seems to me that if we want to do both those things well in the current global landscape, I disagree very strongly with James. If James wants to do defence, that's fantastic, and he should do it with defence money and intelligence and all the other things. And of course there is overlap, of course there is. But I'm more interested in doing poverty reduction well, doing development well, and then there's this growing world of economic diplomacy, and I'm not sure that we're turning our ODA very well to it.
Two quick follow-ups in reverse order. Are you saying that Japan treats India as an investment with a long-term intelligent investment approach? And the first question, what is the it that's working well in Sierra Leone but is not working in Afghanistan? Because until recently, Afghanistan was by far the biggest DFID office, so it wasn't for lack of resources going in, was it?
Yeah, I think there's a whole load of experts who've looked at the DFID defence role, and it's been, when you and not just DFID, of course, the Canadians very much, the Americans. I actually supervised a captain in the Royal Artillery who was one of the key people in the army dealing with DFID, and I think we all agree that Afghanistan is not in a particularly great position. And there's lots and lots of work on that precise relationship and how it worked out on the ground, with people on both sides, all sides, the MOD, intelligence, DFID, trying to do their best. But instrumentalising ODA to serve security purposes is sometimes, again, it's not so much that it's pulling it away from doing poverty reduction, it's just that it's not necessarily always doing security very well either. In terms of the Japanese, on a more comfortable ground here, absolutely, the Japanese do things with their ODA that no one else seems to manage to do. So if I can give you an example from India, they have helped massive loans on low repayment, call development, technical expertise. The UK is struggling, I think. It's trying very hard. There's a lot of great people in India who are trying to make this relationship work within the framework they have. Something that is working really well, interestingly, is something called the Green Growth Equity Fund. It's actually co-designed with the Indians, co-financed. They love it. It's doing interesting investment in small-scale renewables, but it's stretched the definition of ODA to the very, very limit of what we might think ODA is. And we could probably do more innovative and more interesting things if we thought of it as economic diplomacy and funded it. I've got a bigger thesis which you might want to hear just right now, but I think we need to step up our ODA for a new environment without losing the poverty reduction and developmental goals. And I don't think we can do everything under that definition.
Thank you. Can I bring Ian back in again, please?
Just following on from that, the proportion of money that is spent outside DFID is growing. Is it more effective that way, from what you've said? I mean, you were just talking about trying to be more innovative and more. Would it be better to spend it outside the control of DFID?
It's not more effective at poverty reduction or development, and those two things, of course, are different things. I'm not convinced, and Tamsin Barton from ICAI may be able to tell you more. I'm not convinced it's all that much better, actually, at fostering economic diplomacy, relations with middle-income countries, and so on. It's a fairly it's a very restrictive tool, ODA. It lets you do some things and not others. I'm speaking from I know that the danger of my argument is that it will be jumped on by the Henry Jackson Society, who are desperate to kind of snatch ODA and reduce it and all the rest. Forgive me, James.
That's not actually true.
Yeah, right, you're right. Okay, but do different things with it, or by the opponents of who think that this is not spending in the national interest, who think we should be spending it on people in Sunderland and so on. It's not that. I just think if we're going to do poverty and international development well, we need to focus our efforts on it. At the moment, we're trying to do so many other things with ODA as well. We're trying to grab it for this, grab it for that, make it serve these purposes. And I think we would be better to do what we do brilliantly and well through DFID with enormous soft power, with enormous reputational brilliance, and then do this new, growing, booming world of economic diplomacy and development financing that is really pushing ODA to its limits. Britain could lead this. Ian and I were talking, we don't quite see eye to eye, but he was saying this has to be a global effort. Britain could lead this at the OECD DAC. The world is changing. All donors are becoming more mercantilist, more narrowly oriented, and coronavirus shows us the dangers of that. We're going to enter into another period, if we're not careful, I think, of a narrowly defined national self-interest.
Can I ask James, would you comment on that?
In which part?
Basically, the ODA using their ability to they're good war officers to try and carry on Emma's argument. Are they doing it the right way? Is it being effective?
Yeah, I think the issue here is not, we should not be focusing on trying to allocate specific amounts of ODA through different departments. We need to decide instead what we want to achieve with that money in the new changing global environment, and then allocate that accordingly. My preference would be through a single source, or if it is to be allocated through multiple sources, then it needs better oversight to ensure that it is being given with maximum effectiveness, and I think in such a way that is more strategically targeted in the way that Japan is seeking to achieve. Because remember, Japan is now seeing the Belt and Road Initiative that China has embarked on. Now, some people have described this as an international development effort, and in some ways it is, but it's a very specific one, and it's geared towards a very specific objective, and that is to say, to empower China, to put China at the centre of the global economy, and to capture, surrounding China, a number of different states and make them serve the Chinese national interest. In some ways, it's a bid for world power. Now, the Japanese and the Indians, I think, are acutely aware of this because they are the neighbours of China, and they are understanding that they need to coordinate more effectively to provide quality investment to overcome China's sheer quantity and to ensure that there is a degree of coordination between the strategic and more altruistic purposes, that is to say, to improve the situation of numerous countries in that region in which they are located, the Indo-Pacific. So I think you have to understand now that international development is not just about alleviating extreme poverty, it is also intrinsically connected to the changing global order. And we're going to see, I think, increasingly in the years ahead, countries such as Japan and India and other partners of the UK seeking to pursue this kind of agenda. And I would agree that there is actually a great opportunity here for the UK to play a leadership role and to use its resources, which are not inconsiderable. Remember that the UK is spending on ODA around 70% per year what China spends on its Belt and Road Initiative. So under those circumstances, we are not without capacity. What we lack, I think, is strategic direction and, more importantly, a more joined-up approach with our most important democratic allies.
Yes.
Sorry, James, just for clarity, I think what you're saying is that you would still support the funding, probably through DFID or something like it, to alleviate the extreme poverty around the world, but you're seeing international development as needing sort of a being looked at with fresh eyes and maybe a fresh strategy and therefore fresh funding.
Exactly.
As we go forward.
My preference would be for a centralised source for British official development assistance efforts. I do not support the idea of siphoning off little amounts here, there, and everywhere. Around 30%, I think, now goes through other departments other than DFID. That, to me, does not seem to be the most beneficial approach. Yeah. But it could potentially be done like that if there were greater oversight as to how that money is spent through those different departments for a common objective. But from my perspective, we need to focus more on what that common objective is. Yeah. In the changing global conditions, we cannot allow this to take place in a vacuum because we'll be ineffective.
Thank you. Sorry.
I think Ian just...
Yes, thank you. I sort of follow up on a couple of points that Emma made, and I agree with James that the idea of top-down allocations of departmental budgets isn't sensible. And the last strategy and spending review was designed specifically to do that. I mean, the Treasury had a specific idea that 30% would be spent outside of DFID. I was a DEFRA official at the time. Treasury were ringing us up, telling us to find more things that we classified as ODA to spread the money around. But in terms of that, we need to look at the evidence on that, and we've reviewed all of ICAI's sort of 8 years of studies, and we found that even for the objectives that the aid money was given out for, some departments do better than others, and FCO has had 6 reviews and 5 of them have given an amber red. So that's not in relation to poverty reduction, that's in relation to the objectives that they set out for their programmes, which were less focused on poverty reduction. Other parts, like the Ross Fund, for example, have come back very well as a good use of the money. Easy to say now, but the spread of preventable disease, and there are other anti-corruption methods, programmes that have also been seen as successful. So I think it's that top-down allocation and who's got responsibility, and the NAO concluded no one has responsibility for that. No one takes responsibility for that decision to spread the odour and what that strategy achieved. So I think that's a lesson from last time. It should be the effectiveness. Just one other point. I think sometimes we do, understandably after sort of 10 years of austerity, have this discussion in a kind of a UK-orientated context. I think the question we were hinting at just now, or your question was hinting at, is what does the world need? And so donors got together in Istanbul a few years ago and decided that the least developed countries should get between 0.15% of GNI and 0.2% of GNI. And very few donors met that. I think the UK made it for 1 year, and now it's fallen back to 0.12 or 0.13 for the UK. So we're not meeting that commitment on least developed countries, and that's a function, in a sense, of the strategy. Is the money went elsewhere rather than into DFID or into the least developed countries. So, and I think looking globally at what the UK does as a development actor, it's the only G7 country that meets the 0.7, and it's a champion of poverty reduction, and I think it gets a lot of credit for that in the international community. And I think if it went down a road like Japan, then it would lose reputation because of that. It would lose a lot of its influence in many countries. And I think Japan is recognised as a quasi-commercial development actor, and its reputation suffers accordingly.
I mean, Japan for everyone, including, let's say, Burundi, but the Japan model for India. Not in total. I mean, of course, there's much more to Japan and to us, but I think we need to redefine our strategies for middle-income countries, and to look at what India wants and what we can do best, and where we can promote global goals, working in partnership with India. And actually, at the moment, Japan looks more like what they want than we're giving. But we have to be careful. It's always a bundle of activities funded within ODA. But I think we need to,
Richard.
Mr. Mitchell, you described the, if you like, the centrifugal force away from the least developed countries, and that while we might have done that for a bit, it's tending back towards the nearer to middle income countries. Isn't that because it's easier? I remember when the Commonwealth Development Corporation was spending a huge amount of money in middle-income countries. In fact, the National Audit Office did a study, and it was just basically replicating what a lot of emerging market banks were doing, and the chief executive decided to replicate their salaries as well by paying himself nearly £1 million a year. And it was because it was easier to do it than to tackle the really entrenched problems in really, really, really poor places. But that leads on to the underlying question I wanted to ask, is when does poverty reduction become economic development?
So I think you're right. I think it is easier to do aid projects or development in countries that are better off, and to have those partnerships. And the UK, the last strategy had a fragility focus, or at least it said it did, but actually the amount of effort that the UK made in fragile states went down as a proportion of its aid budget during the period of the last strategy that said it would prioritise it. I think also in fragile states and the very poorest, you need more than just aid. You need technical assistance. You need to be there partnering with the government, and again, I think that requires an investment that is difficult to make. It requires staff to take risk. It may involve the involvement of security and so on. I think it's reasonably clear that once countries get to the top of middle income status, that they are in a position to fund their own poverty reduction if they wish to. There's some nice work by ODI and Marcus Manuel on this sort of self-sufficiency pathway. But I think until there's a role for aid both in economic development and poverty alleviation. I think that those things interact.
Yes, that's my point. When does one become the other?
Thank
Yes.
you. Ian, are you
I'm
done?
finished there. Thank you, Sarah.
Theo, sorry.
Thank you. Very interesting. I just wanted to pick up on Ian's point about what proportion of the 0.7 budget should be spent by DFID versus other government departments. So I know in 2018 it was 75% of UK aid was spent by DFID, but I'd be interested to know if each of you have a specific view on what proportion you think should be spent. And I'm particularly interested because obviously DIT was not previously a spending owed to the department, but now is. And there's obviously a number of cross-departmental funds now, like CSSF and the Prosperity Fund. What you think should be spent by other departments, or whether you think it should be spent mainly by DFID. Maybe start with you, Ian.
So I just started by saying I don't think you should set an arbitrary number at the start.
Yeah.
I think it probably would be closer to 80% for DFID if you looked at the value and the return for what's being done. One other thing I wanted to flag in relation to middle income country spending in general, one thing a lot of people have missed is the money we give through the EU, not aid, the 9 billion net money that we give to the EU that will stop at the end of this year, most of that ended up in southern and eastern Europe on economic development projects. So it's not aid, those are not poor countries, but the UK was giving 9 billion to the EU and 5 billion a year was ended up in economic development in those Eastern European countries, which is a huge amount. I think it's something like 0.5% of GNI. So when James is talking about having a more economically focused diplomacy programme and spending for it, I think that's gone under the radar as money that we used to spend that bought us a seat at the table in the EU and that now won't be spent. And I think a slice of that on FCO diplomatic staff, which could be a tiny slice along with a bigger slice for economic diplomacy, could still save relative to what we gave to the EU, but give us both, if you like. If the global Britain strategy is genuine and we're going to step up our presence and our spending, then I would see that being as a big part of that. And then this idea that there's not enough projects to spend 0.7 on, I think is mad. I think if you ever go to a developing country and you say to the ambassador, if we doubled your budget, Kenya or Tanzania or Sierra Leone, could you spend it? I mean, they would bite your hand off for development projects. In Kenya the other day, I was there was 50 kilometres between basic health centres providing nutrition and pregnancy support for children and mothers. 50 kilometres in the World Health Organization recommendation is a 5 kilometre gap. Now, I mean, these are sparsely populated areas, so maybe not 5, but you could double the frequency of those with UK aid money, and you'd literally saving lives. And you can see the handwritten charts showing the number of people that were admitted, and you hear the stories of people that have walked 20 kilometres to get in. So I think, we obviously have to make a decision about how much we provide in overseas aid. It's not limitless, but I think there's this notion that we're trying to find ways to spend the 0.7. I just think that's, if you go out there and talk to the multilateral agencies and our partner countries, there's absolutely a need, and you'll see it with the number of people that die from COVID because the basic health systems just aren't there.
James? I don't know, because the issue is, what do we want to achieve? Because surely that's the issue that should set the amount of money that we allocate through specific departments, if indeed we set that money through specific departments at all, or whether we try to focus it through a single department with a more integrated approach. So I think we need to look at the objectives rather than the amount that we allocate through specific departments or avenues.
Emma?
Yes, I agree. I think it's much more important to look at what we want to achieve and then think which departments are best able to deliver it, rather than put top-down targets where you then get departments desperately trying to find things that might be ODA eligible. I mean, that said, some of DFID's international credibility and weight and ideational leadership comes from its size, comes from the fact it's extremely well used to doing what it does well, and we know that other departments have had to draw very strongly on DFID. And as ICAI reports have shown again and again, DFID has stood up and been able to defend with other institutions the poverty reduction targets and principles. So I do think James is right, it's the objectives of what we want to do that count, and I think we do need to rethink some of those objectives, in which case DFID might be better continuing to harbour and harness the poverty reduction in international development, and those things. International development is a bigger concept than poverty reduction. Global public goods, antimicrobial resistance, climate change, all those, peace and governance, all of those things are a part of international development. So in that regard, I think this idea of just simply pushing it out to different departments and having that as a goal is the wrong way around.
I suppose my concern is that I see over the last previous government, there's been a trend to increasingly spend money outside of DFID, and Dr. Maudie's made a very important point that DFID is seen very well as spending the money well. And I was looking at a previous report called the Aid Transparency Index, and it basically said that DFID is considered to spend taxpayer money effectively and gets value for money, but I'm not convinced that some of the other projects are by other departments. So my concern would be that if we continue to dilute DFID's budget and hand it out to other departments, is that something the panel's worried about? So Ian, for example, on other departments spending the money, like having more of these cross-departmental funds where it's like shared between the Foreign Office and DFID, or maybe it's like the Blue Planet Fund, which is spending money on the environment. Are you concerned that we're actually starting to dilute the aid budget by giving it to other government departments outside of DFID?
So I think the evidence tells us that that actually some of those projects have been successful and some haven't, and I think that the Aid Transparency Index is one of those that suggests that DFID is able to make large parts of its portfolio transparent, whereas other departments struggle. I think as part of the spending review that will go alongside the integrated review, the Treasury should look at the value and the evidence around the projects that can be undertaken and review them on their merits. And I think that as we're seeing some of those projects, I think someone said previously, if contractors had the record of some departments, then if we had a contractor that was performing the way that some departments were, we'd have no hesitation in pulling that budget back and saying, you're spending this money poorly, it's taken you too long, let's review this project and do it differently. And I think we've applied a different standard to some departments in relation to their aid spending, and we've allowed them to build their capacity over time rather than insisting that they spend it well from day one.
I think also the other issue is that I don't necessarily agree that the amount of money that has been allocated to other departments has continued to go up, because actually I think DFID saw a small increase in the percentage of money that it was allocated in 2018. So it went up from something like 22%, from 72% to 75%. So it is a dynamic situation. Again, I would point out that the point for me is not which department should get most or which department should get which percentage, but rather what are we seeking to achieve with our integrated official development assistance effort in comparison or in the context of our broader foreign policy agenda.
In that case, Richard.
Yeah, that's about multilateral spending, the money that is committed right from the start to be being spent by UK aid, but through multilateral agencies, which I believe is about 36% of the total. Do you think that is a good use of UK aid money?
So I absolutely do. I think that it's harder to give multilateral support. It doesn't get your badge on it. It doesn't buy you bilateral favours in UN voting, and so it's harder to do. I think the evidence on multilateral spending on the whole is that it tends to be less fragmented. There is economies of scale. I think if you go to sometimes you go to a development project, you can see 5 badges on the wall from US aid and Italian aid and UK aid and Commission aid. And I think it's much easier for a recipient country to work with a multilateral donor over a period of time, and it varies, so it's not uniform, of course. But I think on the whole, when you look at indicators of aid quality on fragmentation, efficiency, and transparency, then multilaterals score very well. I think the UK is also very good at driving reform at multilaterals and using its staking those multilaterals to do that. So they're obviously not perfect. I think the UK has been successful in driving reform in humanitarian, for example, and the use of cash. So I think it's a big plus for the UK, both in terms of its effectiveness as a donor and in terms of its global leadership role, that it takes a big stake in multilaterals and supports the multilateral system when other countries are standing back from it.
Mr. Rogers?
My view is that we should consider the degree to which we provide this kind of assistance. I mean, to provide money to various multilateral organisations. I think there's a great opportunity here for significant reform in the context that I was explaining earlier. And we have heard, we have discovered in some areas and in some organisations where we've seen significant amounts of money that the UK has allocated to those organisations where they have not been spending it in ways that we would perhaps agree with. For example, my organisation undertook a study of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees last year, and we discovered from this research that a significant amount of the money that was allocated to this was actually being used to promote extremist literature through the Palestinian organisation's educational programmes. Now, this to me does not seem to be the kind of allocation that we would wish to see. So I would suggest that we need to think about reforming the money that we provide to multinational organisations or multilateral forums, and think more about how we can coordinate our efforts with like-minded allies, whether in the case of Japan or various European countries, and also our partners in the developing world, to maximise our impact. In some respects, we have an opportunity to simply wipe the slate clean, or in fact make significant reforms to what has already been achieved, and to ensure that we have the means to push back against those countries that seek to use international development, whether it's China for its Belt and Road Initiative, to capture elites in developing countries and to transform those countries in service of China's national interests.
Sorry, Richard, just for clarity and for the record, UNRWA has pushed back quite robustly about the comments that you made about the refugee literature. Thank you, Richard.
Dr. Morsley, multilateral aid, should we be pushing it, or should we be doing it more unilaterally?
Absolutely pushing it with British leadership. So I think the idea of simply allying up is to beckon the new Cold War even faster as we approach the global apocalypse. Multilateralism couldn't be needed more than ever before. And the coronavirus makes that absolutely clear. So does pretty well every existential threat facing the world. Who would not be without the WHO right now? They're not perfect institutions, of course they're not. There's too much earmarking, too much national interest. And I suppose here is a bigger question about what is the national interest. It is the national interest that we have a strong multilateral system in which all nations, regardless of their political orientation, can come together to try to deal with things like the coronavirus, which we need to do. And we can't do it without them. So we cannot hive ourselves off from that. And to bring it back to the very poorest of countries, we're about to see the most terrible things happen in sub-Saharan Africa and the poorest Latin American countries, and indeed India and other countries which may be middle income but which have massive reservoirs of poverty. And it is in British interest that we try to put healthcare centres and assist Kenyans to provide technical expertise on pharmaceuticals and antimicrobial resistance practices in India, which are very poorly used. So I'm 100% in agreement with Ian, and would just like to see, we must get away from the idea that there's a bifurcation between national interest and multilateralism.
So would you prefer to see more of the available aid money going multilaterally rather than directly?
So content matters and which bit of the system and so on. I'd like us to step up our leadership within the system. One way of using the system would also be to mop up the end of the budget. So instead of trying to push it into unsuitable projects, if we were to use UNDP, to use WHO as a way of getting around our accountancy, the inevitable problems of accounting, that's a particular route of supporting the system. But yes, I would...
You'd like to see it go up?
I would go up, certainly not fall at all.
Certainly not fall?
Yeah.
Okay. Dr. Mr. Mitchell, you said... you referenced cash, I think, among other things. You also said things have improved a lot. I remember very clearly Suma Chakrabarti, when he was Permanent Secretary, talking about the problem of multilateral aid, because the National Office had done a number of studies demonstrating very clearly that the money that went multilaterally was less well spent. Are you saying there's been a transformation and it's now much better than it was?
I don't think we know. I don't think we have a really good understanding of how effectiveness. I think you'd have to go in organisation by organisation. I think if you took at the multilateral system as a whole and said, has it got more or less effective? I think you'd say that there have been helpful reforms that have moved it in the right direction. I mean, I guess James has given us a potential example of where there might be ineffectiveness. I think that the UK can do. If the UK is at the table for those in those organisations, then I think it can make more difference to improving the effectiveness of them than just its own money, if you like. It's a
Does it need to go through multilateral agency? I'll give you an example. So I was working in Sierra Leone, actually, with the National Order some years ago, and I discovered from talking to the embassy there that essentially the French had almost no representation there. They kind of relied on us, and we did the same in reverse in Mali. Now, it's also true that agencies, country offices of various different individual government aid offices can cooperate on the ground quite easily, can't they? To say, as it were, we'll do this over here and you do that over there. They're talking all the time anyway, aren't they?
So I think there is donor coordination, definitely, and that is I think that problem has been overstated in the past. You know, having too many donors is a nice problem to have, and I think, you know, it's not hugely problematic. But I do think that having the multilateral presence there, I suppose I'm thinking particularly of the World Bank and the depth of expertise it has in the countries and the long-term relationships that it has, you know, I think enable it to be a very effective in-country partner that isn't as, I guess if you contrast it with other donors like the US who tend to, you know, come into countries and certain priorities and then come out again, then it's quite difficult to deal with for the partner country. Whereas I think if you know, the aid is going through those multilateral agencies, then I think it can be more effective in that way. I guess, you know, I think DFID is an excellent bilateral donor, and so I can see why Suma Chakrabarti would contrast the effectiveness of some multilaterals in some settings with that of DFID. But I think there's a wider benefit to the engagement with the multilaterals. I mean, you know, by definition, being, you know, contributing to the multilateral system means that things will happen that you aren't necessarily completely born into. I mean, that's what working through multilaterals means, and that's the value of it, is reaching a collective position. So that is the price you pay. And I think I also just draw a brief distinction between using multilateral agencies to deliver so-called, you know, bilateral aid through multilateral delivery channels, which is, I mean, they're effective delivery agencies, so I'm not criticising that necessarily, but what I think I'm arguing for is the core contributions that give the certainty to those organisations to develop international norms. You know, again, WHO is the easy example, but also climate change. I mean, I think we need a multilateral response to that, and that leads to the bilateral approach just isn't going to work.
Thank you.
Thank you. Lavinia.
What is your view about aligning aid spending more closely with British foreign policy interests?
I think it depends what you mean by that. There is often a case is raised from the 1980s, the Purgal Dam incident, and that's often held up to explain why we should not align our aid delivery with our foreign policy interests. But of course, that's only a very specific type of alignment, and probably a form of alignment that is not particularly beneficial neither to ourselves nor to the countries concerned. You might describe this as a form of transactional aid, and of course I think that would be deeply disadvantageous to us. That's the kind of thing that the Chinese do when they provide their so-called foreign aid. What we should be considering is the fact that providing foreign aid is not necessarily out of alignment with our national interests. I mean, it's the way in which we try to target that aid and what we're trying to target it for. So already we have a kind of national aid strategy which states that our four primary objectives are to strengthen global peace, security and governance, to strengthen resilience and response to crises, promoting global prosperity and tackling extreme poverty around the world. So we already recognise that there isn't necessarily some kind of strict distinction between those two things. But what I would draw the committee back to, the thing that I discussed earlier, is that as other countries, particularly China, particularly Russia, provide so-called foreign aid, which is very, of course, different to how we envisage it, as they provide this more transactional aid in order to try and capture developing countries and make them work to their own national interests, we cannot be unaware of this fact, and we cannot do nothing about it, because in time what will happen is quite simple. The likes of China and Russia will grow in power, and we will grow weaker, and more importantly, the countries within the developing world that are subjected to this kind of competition, particularly on the part of the revisionist states, will themselves suffer many different consequences, whether those are those that have been seen in Ukraine or whether those that are seen in Syria. The complete dislocation of the state, the complete destruction of the way of life, and conflict and war. So we have to be aware of this. And what I would argue is that we need to target our assistance in a more strategically defined way, and therefore you get a greater synergy between the two components, the altruistic component on the one hand and the strategic component on the other, and those should not be seen to be mutually exclusive. They're actually, in the new era, I think, increasingly drawn together.
But don't you think that the pursuit of national interest, British national interest, create tension, maybe conflict with the UK's aids, other targets? You mentioned tackling poverty, extreme poverty. So do you not think there's tension created between?
Well, it could produce tension. It's, again, the way in which you deliver it and the way in which you define it and what you're seeking to achieve. So if you want to give aid in the way that China does, in this sort of transactional way, then of course it will create huge problems, and we're already aware of them from our own history and experience. But if you want to target the aid in such a way that it has positive synergies and feedbacks for our own security, which to some extent we say that we are already doing, but we might want to consider further in the context of the rise of major power competition in the world, particularly over the next 20 to 30 years, then of course that's not necessarily the case. So we need to think about this in the context of a broader and more holistic understanding of what we're trying to achieve in the context of international development.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I think it's perfectly possible to align the principles and goals of international development if we count those as peace, prosperity, sustainability, poverty reduction, and I would add less inequality between and within nations, with foreign policy agendas. So a British foreign policy would surely want a world that looked more like that. I think where it's harder is where you come down to operational alignment. So I think that once you put the FCO in charge of ODA money, it can do some good work in places, but I think Britain has national interests that extend in many directions and with many principles and outcomes, and it's not reducible to one small set of goals. So I think those principles of international development that are sort of quite high are entirely aligned. That's not a problem. It's how do we best achieve them, and operationally there can then be more tension in particular places, budgets, staff, tools and so on. So I think I agree in some ways with James about our objectives. I think we probably have very different objectives, but I think I agree that we shouldn't separate out international development from national interest as if the two are in opposition in any way. And of course the classic, I think, problematic binary is to see British poverty in competition with British ODA spending. And I think this is a very understandable question. Some of my colleagues think it's an illegitimate question because the Daily Mail asks it. I don't think it's an illegitimate question at all. But I think it's Britain is and indeed, and so they should. Why, in a context of 2 million people now going to food banks, and I think the answer is that we are, by some counts, the 5th richest country in the world. Poverty in Britain is not because we use 0.7% of our GNI to go overseas, especially when that argument is utterly false. Poverty in Britain is because, in my view, of choices we've made about the allocation of taxation and spend. But, and of course, much of our ODA budget comes back into the UK, legitimately or illegitimately, where once we had Pergo Dam, we now have universities. The ICAI and the National Audit Office pointed out that the most egregious example of tied aid is the Newton Fund. And this too is quite interesting in terms of where while formally not tied, who benefits? And I think this is interesting. So if we tied aid as the Chinese do to external spending, bearing in mind the Chinese are still a much poorer country than we are, it's no longer the, rightly or wrongly, arms manufacturers, the workers on the assembly lines of tanks and helicopters who get the benefit. It's PwC and universities and researchers like myself. Even in thinking about the sort of Pergo Dam and where the benefits of aid come back into the national economy, I would say that's not a particularly inclusive picture. Not every last part of it is wrong. So we need to sort of perhaps move away from the 1980s idea. I think the Pergo Dam haunts us in a way that's actually quite unhelpful for the situation we're in now. And funnily enough, for a leftist intellectual, I would also say that there's a transactional dimension to ODA. It's what is really happening in British aid as much as anything else. We're not that much different in some ways from the Chinese. We give and we expect to receive, and I think we're haunted by this idea that aid is altruistic. It can be altruistic, but it's always political, and we always get things back in return, including global public goods. That's fine. So certainly in some contexts, and India again is another one, the Indians want a more transactional experience. They don't want to be treated like, sort of starving waifs who need a handout. They're a powerful country, and they're a dignified country. Problematic in some regards, but so that more transactionality is actually, in some regards, a culture and an exchange of equals around technical expertise, around projects and programs that could be more desirable in some contexts, not every context.
Can I pick up a really important point you just made about the challenge operationally of aligning with, say, the Foreign Office and DFID? So there was a very important government announcement, which was in the last 2 weeks, about how DFID officials in country will now report to the ambassador. I'd be really interested to know, particularly Ian, what your views are on that, because that is quite a fundamental shift in how we are aligning our objectives. And obviously you'll notice that every single minister now, with the exception of Secretary of State, is now a joint minister. So I'd be very interested to know what your views are on those two things.
So let me pick up on, I just want to agree with Emma basically on the point about national interest. So I think ICAI have said, and we haven't really seen any examples of aid that's purely designed to benefit UK commercial interest yet. And I think that we need to be watchful for that, and I would guess that some officials have had to challenge some of those ideas. I think if those international commercial tie-ups are worthwhile for the UK taxpayer, then we should do them, but not with ODA. I mean, if they're in our own interest and the money has a return, then let's spend that money. That's great, but it's not mainly in the interest of the developing country. So I think commercial is, and that's something we haven't seen yet. I agree with Emma on the national interest point, that it's much broader, and I thought she made an important point, and one that I wanted to mention about research and development, where research and development is a great example of a kind of a global public good, something that we all benefit from. But I think the way that the UK is doing much more on an ODA R&D than any other country by an order of magnitude. I think it has something like £1 billion a year on R&D. I think the way that that's been handed out and the way that it's contracted, there are phrases like awards will normally be made to a UK research organisation, so in the tender documents. So I think there's effective tying there. We're not picking the best researchers or the ones in developing countries that could transfer the knowledge best. We're targeting it towards UK institutions, and I think we should be unwinding that and making the most of that money and focusing it on developing country problems. And I think that would be a useful focus that hasn't got enough attention. And on Theo's point on the new arrangement. So I suppose some people have said, is this a de facto merger of DFID and FCO, both with the ministerial mergers and with the reporting to ambassadors? I think that DFID heads of country offices should have already an extremely close working relationship with the ambassador, and I'm very comfortable with the idea of a dotted line reported arrangement that means that they have a dual line management. I guess for the sake of parliamentary accountability and responsibility for ODA budgets in particular, their responsibilities need to be into their departments into their accounting officers who have responsibility for the money, and that responsibility, it seems to me, stays with DFID officials for the ODA budget, and they should be supported and empowered to challenge the ambassador where that isn't the case. So I'm somewhat comfortable with that. I think the time will tell whether that pressure is being whether there's unreasonable pressure being placed on officials and potential risk of waste. I think on the joint ministerial portfolios, again, I think that seems a sensible move to joint working. I think that is a much better solution to how do you get a joined-up approach for the UK in country than, for example, merging the two departments. And I think time will tell how well that works. I think it can increase, both sets of officials will see each other's briefings. So Foreign Office will see DFID briefings and vice versa. That doesn't always automatically happen, and that's useful to see. A minister that's got responsibility for a region will have absolute clarity about both sides of the house. So I think there are some promising things. I think The problem is that it's all under a sort of a cloud of, what is the motivation for this? And I think if the motivation was to increase the UK's development impact, then I think it could be very positive. I think whether that is the case or whether it's there's this, we're sort of all going on this issue.
Ian,
the idea that
we're straying into speculation. So whilst it's very interesting, in the interest of time, Lavender, do you have any more?
I'll finish that.
Brendan.
Thank you, Chair. Hi, good afternoon. What do you think are the opportunities and risks of merging development with foreign affairs? Do you want to start with that, Chair?
Well, I've written a little bit about that and saying that I support it. I mean, the idea of, I'm assuming you mean here, the idea of merging the Department for International Development with the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. Mm-hmm. My understanding is that if this were to occur in the future, it would be advantageous for the Department for International Development to be rendered an agency with some degree of autonomy within the context of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. And I mean, it is often said that the countries that have done this recently, these being Australia and Canada, which merged their respective independent departments for international development into their foreign offices or foreign ministries in 2013 or from 2013. This led to an increase in efficiency in the context of the delivery of aid, and I think the Aid Transparency Index has already been mentioned in that context. And this, of course, is a possibility, but again, the issue is about how this is undertaken and for what purpose. And you can see in other contexts, such as in Norway or in Denmark, where those respective countries have both held their departments for international development as agencies within their foreign ministries since the 1960s when they were formed, and those have among the highest degree of international development assistance provision in the world. So these two examples, i.e. the Australian and the Canadian one, should not be held up as reasons why this should not be undertaken. Again, I think the issue goes back to where we started, and that is what are we trying to achieve, and how are we trying to achieve it in relation to our other objectives. And as I said, I think it's increasingly important as we face major power competitors that mean us harm, and potentially developing countries harm as well, that we think about how we can create greater alignment between our foreign and our development policy to achieve common objectives with those countries and our like-minded allies and partners around the world.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Maudsley, what do you think?
So I think with a broader view of what our foreign policy goals are, we can say that it's entirely achievable through having separate, different, to recognise that international development is an enormous foreign policy agenda we should have, very much in our own interests as well as those of others. In terms of merging, I think James is right. It's been you can get greater administrative efficiency, but at tremendous losses. So Canada is described as having sabotaged its soft power achievements, and Canada did have a considerable soft power through CEDA, and it sabotaged those with the merger. It's been tremendous frictions. So it depends on Australian aid. I mean, so Canada has kept up its budget, so too did Norway, which at least was better than Australia, which really squandered a huge amount in its move from AusAid. You've probably heard this, AusAid to WasAid. And I think it is different from, say, Denmark and countries where they have long been merged in a rather different consensual political system and so forth, and with a particular form of political leadership. So from what I've read, I did a bit of extra reading this morning, I think it matters more having political leadership, having a clear sense of what it should achieve. I think it would be possible to bring in an effective, in my terms, DFID, if it was retained independent agency status, perhaps under the umbrella of the FCO. I personally don't think that's particularly desirable for the FCO or for DFID. The FCO is traditionally not an implementing department, and it would potentially, actually the worst outcome, of course, is reduce some of the soft power, the effectiveness, the achievements of DFID, and it would distract the FCO from its diplomatic goals. So I think you were right about thinking about alignment, about talking to each other, and the possibilities about how ambassadors and heads of DFID in country talk to each other. But I think there's tremendous risks. I think an absolute merger would be a disaster. bringing DFID as an agency under the FCO would have a lot of risk for both.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Mitchell.
Thank you. I basically agree with that analysis. I think that it wouldn't help FCO. It doesn't give them the budget that they really crave. It just gives them, an extra a huge amount of budget to manage, and it damages the UK's standing and destroys the goodwill and relationships that DFID has built up. And it risks, they're quite a separate cadre of professionals. DFID are all civil servants, most of the Foreign Office are diplomats. Bringing those systems together, I think, is costly and time-consuming and a distraction. I think I agree with James's analysis of the other examples. Canada and Australia did it as a deliberate step back from their international development roles. Denmark did it and made a success of it. They kept a cabinet-level post on development in doing it. In some ways, all of those agencies are relatively small compared to the UK. The US, Germany, and France, who are more comparable to us, all have a separate agency for development. In most cases, in France and US cases, it's for delivery. In Germany, it's they've got one agency for policy and one for delivery. So I think we need to compare ourselves to the major donors. So I certainly see we should keep a separate agency, and I don't think it'd be a good idea for even merging the policy. I think it's not a good idea for the reason that Emma's outlined.
Richard?
One quick question before we finish this session, and that's on an answer you gave earlier about research funding. You said that you sometimes see the rubric saying this money will normally go towards the spending of research with British universities. You made it sound as if you thought that was a bad thing that should be removed from the equation. I've seen examples of research that's jointly funded. I was thinking specifically of the Ifakara Health Institute in Tanzania, which was a joint project of the Swiss government and the Tanzanian government that's been going very successfully for many years. And there's plainly a case for knowledge transfer over a long-term period, and we've got some of the best universities in the world. I don't think there's any controversy about that. We are disproportionately well endowed with top universities. But there's a separate point. If I can put perhaps some words into Mr. Rogers' mouth, would you be content to see British taxpayers' money being used to fund research that was done in other world science centres, namely Russia and China, which both are world science centres, for perhaps with other strings attached, perhaps under the bonnet, that we might not like? Would you be content to see that?
So I suppose in those particular cases, you'd need to consider the risks that came with doing that research through that. But I think if you take the general example, and imagine it wasn't development research, imagine it was research for a flu vaccine or something that was in national interest. Would we give it to a UK institute rather than a German one, just because they're British, not because they're more effective?
But would we give it to an American one rather than a German one? So I was just talking to a colleague of mine who was a medical doctor walking here, and we were talking about the current matter of the moment, and he was saying we have to restore in this country vaccination manufacturing capacity, because we cannot rely on the Americans, because they will once they produce one, they'll have an America first policy. We know that. We have to restore our own capacity here. I'm making a slightly different point, but about the way we use our research funds that we are spending on aid. Should we have? Are you really saying the taxpayer should have no interest in where that goes, other than that it's a good university somewhere?
So I think that as you say, the case you've made about vaccination capability, if you like, is a national security ability to produce at home point, but knowledge is completely transferable, and so it isn't competed for in the way that laboratory capacity is. So I think it should be done where
so that's quite true. It's called intellectual property, and then we have a fight about who pays for it. We saw that with the sequencing of the genome, didn't we?
I think that's right. So I think the principle of research is that it's open knowledge, it's publicly funded, and it's publicly usable. And I think that as a basic principle, we would want to see. I mean, you get a flavour of this with the EU budget going the other way, where some of the EU budget is tied and we're no longer eligible, and so the EU is cutting off its nose to spite its face by saying, well, we'll only use EU-based people, even though there are people in the UK that are more effective. So I think the UK's values are that we should do things where they're most efficient. I think the Russia and China cases are particular examples, but I would absolutely say to the UK taxpayer, yes, let's fund UK-focused research where it's most effectively done, subject to the risks around the partner and capacity. And if that's in the US, then that's great, and we would expect the same of the US in tendering its research projects that they would be done in the UK, you know, if that's, and we would push for that and argue for that. And I think we would apply the same to developmental research and say, I think you'd want to take into account the point you made, which is the ability to transfer the knowledge is greater when you partner with an organisation in the country, and there's, again, with the R&D budget, some issues around that could make that much easier. And but as in general, I think we should be doing it where it's best.
Thank you. Final question. This inquiry is about the effectiveness of DFID. I wonder if each of you could give me one thing, if you had your magic wand, that you would change now to make DFID more effective in your opinion. Emma?
DFID or ODA?
DFID.
Can I read you an email I got? And this will be my comment.
You can read me the top line.
Sorry?
You can read me the top line.
Okay. This is after an article came out in DevEx, which some comments I'd made about separating out an economic diplomacy. This is from somebody working in Tanzania from DFID. The comment about the pretense that private sector projects are poverty reduction initiatives, while friction caused by trying to achieve goals in both areas, mean that in the end we might do both poorly ring true, and I grapple with it daily. She finishes, as we know, economic transformation often generates many losers and does not equate to poverty reduction, yet we're expected to design programmes that achieve these dual objectives. It can be quite depressing. This is her daily reality. I think geopolitically, strategically geopolitically, commercially and developmentally, we need to stop pushing DFID to do all things and recognise that we get a huge amount of benefit when it can do all of those things, but it can't do everything with the same pot of money at the same time. Mm-hmm. So we need to be clear that those are all different legitimate goals for DFID to achieve, but not every project can be economically productive and reducing poverty and geopolitically strategic.
Thank you very much. James, specifically on DFID, what change would you make?
I would want to make sure that it is far more integrated into our broader foreign and defence policy, and I would like to see it funding more research, particularly into green technologies that can help mitigate against catastrophic climate change, but not in authoritarian regimes like Russia or China.
Thank you very much. Ian, you get the last word.
And mine would be, I mean, it's not a million miles from James's, but I would ask DFID to expect more from its departmental colleagues in terms of their wider policy contribution to development. So we're very focused on aid spending, but there are policies that we've discussed on intellectual property, on trade, on climate that are really going to matter to development, and DFID should take the leadership role there in expecting departments to consider the development impact of their policies.
Thank you. On behalf of the committee, can I thank all three of you? You've been incredibly generous with your time. If you'd like to stay for the next session, you're most welcome to. If not, then yes. Thank you very much.